Hello and welcome to the Spectre of Communism podcast. I'm your host. My name's Joe. And if you're familiar with the show, then you'll know this is a bit of a departure from our usual formats because for the first time ever, we are live. And I can already see messages flooding into the chats from all over the world. I see Austria. I see Denmark. I see Sweden. Thank you so much, comrades, for joining us all. Now, Alan Woods, editor-in-chief of Marxist.com, and if you've been following the show, you'll remember as our first ever guest on the Spectre of Communism, talking about the Russian Revolution, was planning to give a speech to the East London district of Socialist Appeal, soon to be the Revolutionary Communist Party. That's the British section of the International Marxist Tendency. But we thought it's such a fascinating and important topic, why not share it with the world? So for that reason, we decided to make Alan's lead off available via the podcast for the first time ever in real time. I'm not going to waste any more of your time or Alan's. I'll hand it over to the man himself in just a moment. So without further ado, Alan, if you're ready, then you can begin.
Okay, well, I suppose I'd better start by saying Merry Christmas. But here the first problem arises. What exactly are we supposed to be celebrating on these dates? The answer, of course, you'd say is quite clear. It's the birth of Jesus Christ. But is it? Is it really? Well, not really, because for your information, and by the way, you can check your Bible. I hope you've brought your Bibles along this evening. You can check all the quotes I'm giving. You can search the Bible as much as you like. You'll find that nowhere does the Bible say anything about the date of the birth of Christ. It's not there. In fact, the early Christians celebrated the birth of Christ on the 7th of January. In some countries, they still do. But not the 25th of December. They later changed that because nobody was celebrating the 7th of January. Everyone continued to celebrate what is a very old festival, the 25th of December, or thereabouts. I won't argue with the details for you expert astronomers. But you see, the 25th of December is really the winter solstice, which, like all the other pagan festivals, the pagans, of course, were agricultural people, and therefore the transition from one season of the year to another was decisive for those people. And therefore they celebrated these changes in these solstices in a big way. It was a question of encouraging the sun to return. Usually it was accompanied with bonfires and all kinds of festivities. And this, of course, is purely a pagan affair. And the pagan elements of Christmas still persist. I mean, for example, take this figure, Father Christmas. Where does he come into all this? You won't find him in the Bible, of course. Of course, the church is very canny, and they rapidly baptize the poor chap as Saint Nicholas or Santa Claus, as it becomes. Not so. This is clearly some kind of a pagan god which has crept into the festivities. Then there's the Christmas tree. What's that got to do with anything? If you know anything about ancient religions, the trees were worshipped. I'm thinking particularly of the Druids in my own country, Wales. They didn't have churches. They celebrated in religious growth, oak trees, actually, with mistletoe. Now, when I was a young chap, a child, people used to bring mistletoe to the house. I don't know if they still do that. I don't think so. But mistletoe is a parasitic plant found on oak trees, actually. And the berries resemble actually little suns, and that's what people thought that they were. They thought they were engendered because it's a parasitic plant with no obvious roots to it. But they thought it came down with the lightning, and therefore it was like little suns, and therefore that is all connected with the worship of the sun. I won't bore you with the details. When I was a young chap, of course, if you hung up a bunch of mistletoe in the halls, we were a lot more puritanical in those days. You could actually give a girl a kiss under the mistletoe. Yes, I don't think they bother with that much anymore. But in the old days, they did quite other things under the mistletoe, about which we will not expand any further in the present program. Then there's Bethlehem. That's where Christ was supposed to be worshipped, in Bethlehem, you know. Bethlehem, that's an interesting one. And how were the three? I'll deal with the three wise men in a moment. But how did the three kings or the three wise? How did they find this place, Bishop? They followed the star, did they not? It's in many English carols. They follow the star of Bethlehem. Well, for your information, Bethlehem had nothing to do with Christianity. It was actually the cult center of the goddess Ishtar or Astarte, known by the Greeks as Aphrodite, and by the Romans as Venus. And as you astronomers will know, Venus is the brightest star in the firmament, except it's not a star, of course, it's a planet. But the old guys weren't to know that. This is all pagan stuff. Every element that the kids sing about in the Christmas carol is from pagan religions. Yes, and the three kings, who were they weren't originally three kings. That was introduced later to give the royals, the newborn babe, a bit of a more high-bred status. They were originally the three wise men, or rather the magi, or the magi. These were Persian fire worshippers, no less, Persian priests from an entirely alien religion from the East. So out of all this concoction around the Christmas period, not a shred of Christianity remains, not one element remains. There's not an element in it. And by the way, that's true of all Christian festivals. They're all pagan festivals, as a matter of fact, and all to do with a different solstice. This one particularly is a very ancient festival. It was known to the Romans as the Saturnalia. It's the time of year when peasants slaughtered their pigs. In some parts of the world, that's still the case. They slaughtered their pigs and fested and ate and drank to their heart's contents, and generally made merry until they came, of course, to the approaching hard winter months which lay ahead. And as I say, all Christian religions have a similar origin. Halloween was the pagan Celtic festival of the dead. Easter was a celebration of the spring solstice, when the sun revived after the winter's sleep. And by the way, it's named after in English anyway, named after the pagan goddess Eostre, and was usually accompanied with human sacrifice, which, by the way, explains its association with the Christian story of the crucified Christ rising from the dead. But we won't go down there. That's another matter of discussion. Now, to return to this question of the birth of Christ, you see, the first question that must be asked, you might think it's a redundant question. It certainly is not. It's a very serious question, which remains to be answered. And that is as follows. What solid historical evidence exists even for the existence of Jesus Christ? Now, this was dealt with in a brilliant work of historical materialism by a man that you may have heard of, Karl Kautsky. It's true he later evolved in a very undesirable manner. That's another matter. This is when he was a Marxist, and it's a very good book, which I recommend you to read. You might like to read it over Christmas for a bit of light entertainment. It's also a very serious work of Marxist historical study. It's called The Foundations of Christianity, and I recommend it. Now, you see, if we're going to look for evidence for the existence of Jesus, surely the first place that we should look, the first stop ought to be the non-Christian sources, written sources. Now, you see, most people don't realize this, but you must remember that the period under consideration here was not the Dark Ages at all. What you're talking about here is the high point of the Roman Empire, which comprised most of the known world, at least in Europe and the surrounding areas at that time. This was a highly literate world. It wasn't illiterate, with a wealth of literary and historical sources, plenty of them. There are plenty of very excellent historians of that period. Now, if we believe what the Bible tells us, this was a most extraordinary period in history, was it not? I mean, the blind could see, the lame could walk, even the dead could be raised on occasion. And huge multitudes, masses of people assembled all over Judea to listen to the speeches, the preachings of Jesus Christ. Now, you see, Judea at this time was actually a province of the Roman Empire. And therefore, one might expect at least some kind of reports concerning these developments in the written records of the time. But when you consider the Roman sources, which is the most important field, you will only find hardly anything. You'll only find just a couple of scanty references to the existence of, not of Christ, by the way, reference to the existence of the Christians. Now, the existence of the Christians in the first century is not under dispute. They certainly did exist, and we'll deal with that question later on. But the only references that I can remember offhand, and I know them pretty well, is one in Tacitus and the other in Pliny. However, as I say, these do not tell us anything whatsoever about the life of Christ at all, only about the Christians. However, and this is most interesting, this perhaps you don't know, there is one other reference, which is of crucial importance to this discussion, because it was written by a Jewish writer, a very good historian, I might add, a famous historian at the time, which was a contemporary source. He lived at that time. I refer to a man by the name of Flavius Josephus, famous author, who actually wrote a detailed history of Judea at that particular time. I got his book on this one of the shelves. I've had the book for many years, an old volume which I treasure. And in one of these works, The Antiquities of the Jews, there's a whole chapter that deals with Pontius Pilate. Now, those of you that remember some scraps of religious education from your school years will remember who Pontius Pilate was. He was the Roman governor of Judea, the man that tried and foresaw the execution of Jesus Christ. So therefore, this is important. Now, this is important. And there's a chapter on Pontius Pilate in Flavius Josephus's book. Quite interesting, very interesting. Now, in this book, we find the following quote. I will read it. I know it by heart, but I'll read it just to be sure. About this time, there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed it be lawful to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. Now then, that's really something, isn't it? That's really a statement. Now, the problem is this. This statement, this paragraph, it's just a little paragraph, that's all, is an isolated paragraph with no further elaboration or mentions either before or after it. Well, there is a brief reference after it, but that's of no consequence. Now, this is strange, isn't it? This is very strange. You see, given the importance, the enormous importance of the statement itself, it says he was the Christ. That is to say, he was the Messiah. Now then, you see, the problem is this. It's plain as the nose on your face that it is impossible, materially impossible, for Flavius Josephus to have written these lines. Utterly impossible. What you must know about this man is that he was a Pharisee. I'll deal with the Pharisees later on. But that is to say, a member of an ultra-Orthodox Jewish sect. And for him to admit that Jesus was in fact the Christ, the Messiah, that would be the worst kind of blasphemy that one could imagine. No, this is out of the question. Absolutely out of the question. You can't twist and turn and mess around. This is a forgery. As simple as that. Now, what's the reason for this? Well, there's a simple explanation. You see, these books were written out painfully by hand, by scribes over a long period of time, centuries actually. And evidently at some time, a long time in the future, centuries later, some Christian monk that was faithfully copying out the text decided in his horror that it wasn't acceptable to have the absence of Christ in this Jesus Christ. It was undesirable, and therefore he took the simple remedy of adding the aforementioned passage. As simple as that. A plain, straightforward, and blatant forgery, but you can't argue with that. Of course, you might argue, therefore there's no mention of Jesus Christ in Flavius Josephus, none. Now, you could argue that perhaps maybe the silence of Flavius Josephus was precisely an expression of religious fanaticism on his part. He just didn't want to mention the existence of Christ and so on, you know. Now, this explanation explains nothing. It doesn't bear examination. For the simple reason that in the same text of Flavius Josephus, we find many references to individuals who he describes as false prophets, and he polemicizes against them. For example, that's interesting, there is a Judas of Galilee. Yes, he's there, and he denounces him as a false prophet, among many others. Yes, but no Jesus. No Jesus Christ. Clearly, if he existed at all, which is not established, then the existence of this figure was completely unknown to Flavius Josephus, who was a very, very meticulous historian, as a matter of fact, who dealt with the period of this period in great detail. So we are thrown back on the sole existing sources available to us on this question, and that's the four Gospels. Now, I could ask you a question, but unfortunately, because of this format, you're not able to answer, but I'll ask it anyway. Who wrote the four Gospels? Now, some hands are shooting up all over the world, I guess. And I'm told immediately, instantly, like a flash, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Correct. Next question. Who were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Again, the hands shoot up all over the world. They were Christ's disciples, weren't they? Well, no, my friends, actually, they were not. Not at all. They were not Christ's disciples. Nobody knows who the real name of Christ's disciples. They were called these names in the Bible, but that's all there is to it. The scholarly consensus, for what it's worth, is that the Gospels, the New Testament, as we call it, was the work of unknown Christians. Never mind of Mark, Luke, and John, forget that. Unknown Christians, don't know what their name was. Unknown Christians, and were composed, get a load of this, were composed not at the time, but around 68 to 110 AD, to use my old-fashioned terminology. In other words, a long time after Christ was supposed to have died. And yet, despite this huge gap in time, they claim to report speeches, sermons, delivered at mass gatherings without any microphone. By the way, didn't have technology in those days, many decades after Christ had died. Moreover, these speeches and sermons actually contradict each other very seriously and very frequently. We shall come to that in a moment. And my objective in showing these contradictions is not to say that this is absurd. It's not absurd. It actually reveals some interesting things, as we shall see. Let me take one of the most famous of these speeches, these sermons, the Sermon on the Mount, which you've probably heard of. Now, everybody knows, or most people, most Christians anyway, think that they know what is known as the Beatitudes. You know, blessed be the so-and-so and blessed be the so-and-so. At least they think that they know them. Let's have a look. Let's compare two versions. Matthew and Luke. We'll use that terminology, since it's common. And we find very striking differences between the two. Let's start with Matthew. You know, how does this sound to you? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Correct? Does that sound familiar to you? I bet it does. Okay. It goes on. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And this is interesting. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Again, sounds familiar. Do it not? Does it not? Of course it does. But just compare this with Luke, which I don't suppose you have done. This is what Luke says. And he lifted up his eyes, that's Christ, he lifted up his eyes on his disciples and said, "Blessed be ye poor," not poor in spirit. "Blessed be ye poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." Now, do you not see that there's a fundamental difference between the two? A rich man can be poor in spirit, you know. Rishi Sunak can be poor in spirit, although he's very wealthy in his bank accounts. He's very poor in spirit. Poor chap. Okay. But Luke doesn't say that. He says, "Blessed be you poor." Actual poor people. Now that's different. Let's go on further. And he goes on, Luke goes on and says, "Blessed are ye that hunger now," not hunger and thirst after righteousness. A rich man can hunger and thirst after righteousness. It doesn't say that at all. "Blessed be ye that hunger now," the actual hungry poor people of Judea. "For you shall be filled," he says. For ye shall be filled. And he goes on, "Blessed are ye that weep now, for ye shall laugh. Blessed are ye when they shall hate you, and when they shall separate you from their company, and shall reproach you, and cast out your name as evil for the Son of Man's sake. Rejoice in that day." Rejoice in that day when everyone curses you and attacks you. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy. For behold, your reward is great in heaven. For like in the manner did their fathers unto the prophets. In other words, they attacked the prophets in the past in the same way. That's Luke. And Luke goes on. Get a load of this. He goes on. "But woe unto you who are rich, for ye have received your consolation. Woe unto you that are full, for ye shall hunger. Woe unto you that laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. Woe unto you when all men shall speak well of you, for so did their fathers to the false prophets." Now there's revolutionary talk for you. There's class hatred for you by the bucketful. And not a single word of this in Matthew. It doesn't say anything about woe unto you who are rich and woe unto you that are filled. Now that's Luke. In other words, these are two totally different versions. And the contrast between the two of them is quite clear, and it is a class question. I'll come to that again in a moment. Now, the early Christians, as we'll deal with this in a moment, started out as a revolutionary movement of the poor in Judea, in Judea. And in order to understand, if we really want to know the reasons why this emerged and how it emerged, then we forget about the texts. You can't learn anything more from the text than what we have done already. We must understand the material conditions. We are materialists. We must study the material conditions that existed in Judea at that time. Now, at one time, Judea was quite a prosperous province in the Middle East, of course. That depended on its geographical position. It was at the intersection of important trade routes with Asia, Africa, and so on. Yes, but the development of sea trade, by the Greeks had undermined that position. And by the time we are considering, Judea had been reduced to the status of a very impoverished outpost of the Roman Empire. And it's not an accident. If you read the Gospels, you can learn something from the Bible. It's no accident that the picture that emerges of Jewish society at that time in the four Gospels is one of unrelieved poverty and suffering of the masses. Not an accident that Jesus Christ spent most of his time mixing with the poor, the sick, the old, the oppressed, the downtrodden, the prostitutes like Mary Magdalene, and so on and so forth. And as always, they were rich and poor. By God, they were rich and poor. And the class struggle in Judea seemed a particularly sharp and violent character. There was nothing pacifist about the Jewish people, nothing at all. Violent uprisings in Judea were common occurrences. Now, given the whole history and traditions of the Jewish people, it's no surprise that these uprisings habitually took on a religious colouring. And I should point out one thing to you, which perhaps hasn't occurred to you. At this time, of course, there was no such thing as political parties. no such thing as the Bolshevik Party or anything like that. But there were, but the religious sects, many religious sects and movements, which did have a clear class content to them. They reflected definite class interests. And Jewish society was sharply divided on class lines. There was class hatred, of tremendous class hatred. At the tops of society, at the apex, the top, there stood one sect known as the Sadducees. This was the priest caste. These wealthy parasites, that's what they were, collaborated with the Roman authorities. It was a province of Rome. The Romans conquered Judea. And their wealth depended on the colossal wealth of the Temple of Jerusalem. So here's a sea of misery, poverty, unemployment, hunger, and so on. And in the middle of the sea of poverty, there's this massive temple. By the way, it's not a building, the temple. You get that? It's not like Canterbury Cathedral or Westminster Abbey. It's not like that. It's a huge complex, a vast complex of buildings with a temple at its center, surrounded by all sorts, and swimming in wealth. Where did the wealth come from? Well, I suppose you could say from the tourist trade. Many Jews lived outside of Judea. The Jewish diaspora does not date, as is commonly assumed, from the other events which I'm about to describe, the destruction of the temple by the Romans and so on. No. It antedates that by centuries. The Jews were largely involved in trade, and they were these traders, Jewish traders, were present all over the Roman world, in Antioch, in Alexandria, in Rome, many other cities, and so on. And they still looked back to Jerusalem, back to the temple, back to their native land and their traditional religion, the Jewish religion, and they sent large amounts of money to the temple, which of course ended up, a lot of it, in the pockets of the priest caste, who were hated by the people, hated altogether. The Sadducees actually adopted Greek names, which is anathema to the Jews, Greek dress also, and they were looked upon with suspicion and hatred by most people. And not just by the ordinary people, the poor people, which you could understand, but also by another sect, which you might have heard of, the Pharisees. It's a word that's passed into the English language, that does with other languages, meaning a horrible hypocrite and Philistine. The Pharisees, these were wealthy, in the main, wealthy merchants, well-to-do people. They were people of standing in society who ostentatiously maintained a rigid adherence to traditional Jewish customs and religion. As I've said earlier on, Flavius Josephus was a Pharisee. He was one of these people. They were opposed to Roman rule and also to the domination of the Sadducees. But their opposition was always tinged with fear of the masses. They were always looking over their shoulders, quite fearful of anything involving the masses in any opposition. Therefore, they played a role very similar to that, I would say, of modern bourgeois nationalists in Africa, Asia, and so on, you know. Now, Jesus Christ in the Bible always speaks of the Pharisees with the most profound contempt. He describes them, and I quote, as the generation of vipers, poisonous snakes, and whited sepulchres. A sepulchre is a tomb, whitewashed on the outside, so it looks nice and clean, but inside the tomb it's all dark and full of rotting flesh, and it stinks. Whited sepulchres, he called them. Very effective language. And Flavius Josephus was actually quite a typical representative of this class, who incidentally went over to the Romans in the episode which I'm just going to describe. He sold out the Jews. He initially supported a Jewish uprising, which I'm going to deal with. And he went over to the Romans, and he was a collaborator, in other words. He betrayed the people and went over to the side of the Romans, who inflicted a bloody defeat on the Jews in the year 70. Now, there was another, I will deal with that in a moment. There was another party, there were many parties actually, a party of the streets, you might say, the very poor people, known, and this word is also passed into the English and other language, known as the zealots. You know, a zealot, zeal, zealots. The word is passed into many languages. This was a group, a sect, representing the most downtrodden sect of the lumpen proletarians, if you like, always ready to stage riots and uprisings. They had a very militant wing called the Sicarii, named after a curved knife, which they used to perpetrate assassinations and so on. And there was actually another party, another sect, about which until recently not very much was known, but it's an important sect, particularly related to the origins of Christianity. I refer to the Essenes. And now Karl Kautsky, who I've already mentioned his brilliant work, Foundations of Christianity, was of the opinion that the early Christians were probably an offshoot of this movement of the Essenes. And I think that's a very likely supposition. We don't know exactly, but it may well be the case. And funnily enough, not much was known about this sect until recently. Kautsky had to base himself on other sources to put together what I think was quite an exact picture. The Essenes actually were communists, by the way. They didn't believe in private property, like the early Christians. And their rituals and ceremonies strongly resemble those of Christianity, although they've been carbon dated through the Dead Sea Scrolls, which you might have heard of. And the dates comes up, I think, about 134 BC or something like that. In other words, here's a sect which is strongly similar in many ways to Christianity. By the way, they have a founder, they mentioned in their documents, in the scrolls, who's not named, he has no name, but he was crucified. Although that may not be so significant, because many people, it was a normal method of execution that the Romans employed. But nevertheless, they likewise held their goods in common. Now, about 2,000 years ago, then, you get the emergence of this new sect, Jewish sect initially, the Christians, which developed into a mass movement of the poorest and most downtrodden sections of society. The early Christians were undoubtedly on the side of the poor and took their stand against the rich and powerful, against both the Sadducees and the Sadducees. The Bible itself informs us that Christ himself moved among this layer, as I've said, the poor, the dispossessed, and also that he frequently attacked the rich. It's not an accident. If you read the Bible, when he comes into Jerusalem, returns to Jerusalem from the desert at the end of his life, what's the first thing he does? He enters the temple and drives out the money changers. Yes, but you see, this is not no small thing. It wasn't just a small group of money changers in a couple of tables. No, this had been a huge compass, like a market. In order to drive out these money changers, one man couldn't have done it. It would have required an insurrection, and we probably are talking here about some kind of an insurrection, although the details are not clear. But Christ, in the Gospels, is quoted as saying, for example, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. I think that's fairly clear. It's class language, isn't it? And in the Bible, there are many other examples. For example, in James, I'll quote this at them because I rather like this passage. It's really good agitation, you know. I wish we could agitate as well as this. Go to now, you rich men, weep and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver is cankered, and the rust upon them shall be witness against you, and shall eat your flesh as if it were fire. You have heaped treasure together for the last days. Behold, the hire of the labourers who have reaped and sown your fields, which is by you kept back by fraud, crieth, and the cries of them which have reaped are entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. Wonderful stuff. This is the language of class hatred written in giant letters. And also the early Christians were communists. Oh yes, they didn't believe in private property. They were much more radical than us, by the way. When you join our organization, we ask you to pay quite a high sub, which I hope you do. Hope you'll increase it after this talk. We live in hope. But no, the early Christians, if you joined them, you had to give up all your worldly goods, your house, your wealth. I was going to say your car, but they didn't have cars in those. Your camels then, everything. You had to hand over the lot. And that was then given to shared out among the community, among everybody. It's stated, you don't believe it, it's stated in the actual Acts of the Apostles, which you should read. You get an accurate description. Here we read the following, and I quote, "And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship." That is to say, communism. The Greek word is koinonia. "And in the breaking of bread and in prayers. And all that believed were together and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods and parted them and parted them to all men, as every man had need. From each to his need, from everyone to his needs shall be given," and so on. In other words, Christianity first appears as a religion of the downtrodden, the oppressed, the slaves and emancipated slaves, the poor people, deprived of all rights, and people subjugated and dispersed by Rome. And it's not an accident. By the way, it's not an accident that the Romans accused the Christians of being a religion of slaves and women. Not an accident, because both those slaves and women were deprived of all their rights. Engels, wrote quite a lot about the early history of the Christian church. He even wrote a special piece, which I'll mention later, about the book of Revelation. And I quote, and this is an interesting quote by Engels, as you might like to consider. "The history of early Christianity," says Engels, "has notable points of resemblance to the modern working class movement." I'll get a note of that. He goes on, "Both are persecuted and baited. Their adherents are despised and made the object of exclusive laws, as Bismarck's laws in Germany. The former as enemies of the human race," that's the Christians. "The latter as enemies of the state, enemies of religion, the family, and social order. And in spite of all persecution, nay, even spurred on by it, they forge victoriously ahead." That's Engels. Now, the question arises, where did this Christianity come from? Now, you see, it emerges out of a great historic defeat. I'm referring to what is known as the Great Jewish Revolt, a huge uprising which began in the year 66 and only ended when the Roman legions under Titus besieged and destroyed Jerusalem. And by the way, this is really something. When Titus, deliberately destroyed Jerusalem, I mean it. The Romans massacred the entire population of Jerusalem, men, women, and children, without mercy. And they looted and burnt the temple to the ground. They destroyed the temple, this holy of holies of the Jewish people. And the Jewish rising was brutally crushed. The last remnant was the notorious siege of Masada, which occurred about 3 years later, where the final element was rooted out in their last stronghold in the desert. And according to what Flavius Josephus said, about 900, maybe 1,000 people, men, women, and children, committed suicide in order to avoid falling into the hands of the Romans. Now, just think for a moment, use your imagination. To the people of Judea at that time, it must have seemed like the end of the world, the destruction of the temple. The Jewish people were reduced to a state of utter despair. Now, the oldest book in the New Testament, for your information, is known as the Book of Revelation. Very interesting. It's a very strange work, this book, very strange. Engels wrote about it at some length. It's a strange work, full of the most bizarre imagery, very powerful imagery, and wild predictions about the coming end of the world. But it has absolutely nothing to say about the life of Jesus, nothing at all, nothing at all. And it was only narrowly accepted as part of the Christian Bible by the original synod of bishops and so on. Yet Engels, who wrote, as I said, this lengthy analysis, regarded this book as the most authentic expression of the mindset of early Christians in the first century. It's the voice of a persecuted and defeated people cursing their oppressors I remember one quote in particular, which is quite striking. Again, I wish we could write like this, Thomas. I wish we could. Our writings are far too bland, you know. Please learn how to write like these guys wrote. Mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Babylon, of course, is Rome, naturally. But this is a man that's been defeated, horribly defeated and depressed and downtrodden, cursing his oppressors. But these are people who are traumatized. No other word for it, traumatized by terrible and bloody defeat. And therefore they no longer dream of a kingdom of God on earth, because there's no justice to be found on earth, and God has abandoned them. Instead of that, they begin to place their faith in a kingdom that is yet to come. And Jesus Christ says, my kingdom is not of this world, and that is the key. That is the key. These early Christians had a powerful message, actually, for all the enslaved and professed and oppressed and exploited people of the earth. It's no longer a message of rebellion because they've been defeated, they've been crushed, they don't see any hope of any justice in this life. Rather, it offers consolation, the consolation of eternal life after death for those who believe it. Now, this was a new and revolutionary message. It doesn't sound like that to us. It's very new to them. Because prior to this, if you look at ancient religions, life after death barely featured in these religions, except for the upper classes, like in Egypt. They gave a lot of it, but that was for the upper class. That was for the pharaohs, not for the masses. Insofar as the afterworld was ever mentioned, it was a dreary and unpleasant place to be in. In fact, life to live after death was considered by the Greeks rather a misfortune. And if you read I think it's in the Odyssey, that's what's in the Odyssey, a description of the spirits which are brought up from below. Well, frankly, you read that, you wouldn't want to spend 5 minutes in such a place, much less all eternity. Then along come the Christians with this tantalizing promise of recompense and punishment, of course, for the bad people in the world beyond the grave. And they were the first ones really who created heaven and hell in the sense that we would understand it. Now, this offers, if you think about it, this promise offers a way out. It offers a way out for the laboring poor, the slave, the women who wanted to find a road out of this veil of tears, as the Bible describes life. The world is a veil of tears, into eternal bliss in paradise. This is a powerful message for many people, especially, like I said, for women and slaves and so on. Now, beginning as an insignificant Jewish sect, that's what they were to start with, a tiny little Jewish group. The Christians grew rapidly. I do believe what Kautsky said, that they were probably an offshoot of the Essenes. I think that's an acceptable hypothesis. They grew rapidly, particularly when they decided to try to win over non-Jewish people. Now, that was a big step forward, the non-Jewish peoples of the empire. The early Christians, of course, were quite interested in this idea of a life after death and other stuff, but they weren't quite so keen on the idea of a rather painful operation on their private parts, which, as you know, is part of the Jewish creed. Nor were they anxious to give up eating pork and other stuff of that sort. So, naturally, the Christians were quite smart, dropped all that stuff. And then they began to develop rapidly. They developed rapidly. And because of this wonderful world which they promised, and their communist element also must have played a huge role, they then began to grow. And of course, the growth alarmed the authorities, alarmed Nero in particular and others. But the early Christians, as Engels said, they showed great courage. They were very courageous. We should respect them for that. They were courageous people. They were quite brave in facing death and torture and everything. They prepared to endure the ghastliest forms of torture to defend their faith, defying the state and the ruling class and perishing in the arena. Now, the reason for this ferocious persecution is that this movement, this mass movement of poor and dispossessed people, undoubtedly represented a threat to the existing order. Yes, but despite decades of persecution, it wasn't as bad as what they say, by the way. It's greatly exaggerated by the Christians, the amount of persecution that took place. I might add, by the way, that the Romans never forced anyone to change their religion. As long as you accepted the rule of the emperor and paid your taxes, you were all right. More or less all right. You were still a slave to the Romans, of course. But as for religion, they weren't interested in religion. And the persecution of the Christians is exaggerated, as a matter. There was some persecution. It was in waves, and it wasn't all that intense. It bear no relation to the savagery later shown by Christians towards Christians. We'll deal with that later on. Anyway, all this persecution, it didn't succeed. That's the point. The ruling class is quite generally not unintelligent, although maybe they have to change that nowadays, but there you go. The Romans, anyway, were not particularly stupid, and they realized that they couldn't crush this movement by force. And the ruling class always got in any period, they got two ways of dealing with problematic movements, dangerous movements. One is by violent means of repression, and the other is by bribery and corruption. Yeah, you got both these, and they apply both these methods. Now, realizing the impossibility of defeating Christians by repression, the ruling class changed its tactics. And at the same time, there was a change beginning to happen in the church itself. Under the prevailing conditions, the leadership of the church, starting with the bishops, I'll tell you about the bishops in a moment. The bishops, in effect, I should add now, were the treasurers. That's all they were originally. The bishop was the man who looked after the subs. You know. By the way, who was the first bishop, do you know? Most Catholics will probably say St. Peter. Well, not so. Not so. That's not correct. First bishop, my friends, is going to surprise you now. The first bishop was Judas Iscariot. Oh, yes. He was the original bishop. He was the original treasurer. John, actually, I quote there, John says that Judas Iscariot, I quote, was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, so they had a money bag then to keep the funds in, he used to help himself to what was put in it, says John 12:6, in case you want to follow it up. Okay, but it's not the first time or last time that the treasurer has run off with the funds. I hope that none of our treasurers feel offended by that observation. Anyway, but this layer of bishops gradually began to rise above the poor people under them. And they began to come under pressure by the ruling class of the state. They gradually moved away from the original communistic beliefs of the movement. Now, there is a book which, again, I would recommend. It was rather a large book. It's 6 volumes. I don't expect you to read it. I read it when I was 14. I couldn't put it down. Marvelous work by the English historian of the 18th century, Edward Gibbon. Fantastic historian, by the way, who incidentally was a man of the age of reason. I believe he was an atheist, and he certainly hated the Christians with a passion, and he shows it in his book. But anyway, I'm quoting from memory now. It's a long time. I was 14 years of age, but I'm pretty sure it made such an impression on me. It's in a footnote in the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, where he quotes one a Christian bishop of Africa, as saying the following, and I quote from memory: "My vows of obedience have placed me above the heads of men. My vows of poverty have given me an annual income over 100,000 golden marks." And Gibbon, in his usual sarcastic tone, adds, "The worthy bishop does not disclose to what excesses his vows of chastity led." Typical Gibbon. There we leave that as it may be. But you see, the way in which this upper layer was corrupted, was bought by the ruling class of the empire, can be seen by the following passage by the historian of the early church, the best-known historian, Eusebius. And he describes the Council of Nicaea, famous council, in the year 325, presided over by the emperor himself, Constantine. By the way, he describes like some messenger of God. Now just get a load of that. For servile bootlicking, The emperor is described here as appearing in the assembly like some messenger of God, he said. And to quote Eusebius, now this really shows. Just imagine you're talking about a modern trade union leader. You won't go far wrong. Listen to this. The circumstances of the banquet were splendid beyond description. This is a banquet organized by the emperor, and he invites the Christian bishops to attend it. The circumstances of the banquet were splendid beyond description. Detachments of the bodyguard and other troops surrounded the entrance of the palace with drawn swords. I mean, a few years earlier, you'd have been terrified. That's such a sight. But no, they trooped in anyway. And he goes on, and through the midst of these men, these armed men, the men of God proceeded without fear to the innermost of the imperial apartments. Just imagine, they allowed us, humble men of God, into the innermost apartments of the imperial palace. Good heavens above. He goes on. Some of these men of God, some were at the emperor's own companions at table. Good heavens above. Others reclined on couches, ranged on either side. One might have thought, get a load of this. One might have thought that it was a picture of Christ's kingdom and a dream rather than reality. Isn't that priceless? That's from the horse's mouth. That's Eusebius. Now, these methods, of course, should be similar to any trade unionist today. Precisely the same method was still used to this day to buy and corrupt the labor leaders and so on. The tops of the movement invited to expensive dinners and parties where they rub shoulders with the rich and famous, and they become one of the club. Now, ever since the Council of Nicaea, which I'd mentioned, I'd like to go into in detail the proceedings, the pantomime that took place there to decide what's in the Bible and what's not. Leave that to one side. No time for that. But ever since that time, the church has been the firmest supporter of wealth, privilege, and oppression in society. The educated classes in Rome, who would never have joined the church before, now flocked to it. Now they was under the protection of the emperor, why not? And they brought with them the traditional ideas and class outlook, and all the philosophical baggage of paganism that infected Christianity and completely altered its character. Engels writes, this is interesting, Philo, he was a philosopher, a pagan philosopher. Philo, and particularly Seneca, another one, had a great influence on emerging Christianity. And the authors of the New Testament were exposed by Bruno Bauer, as downright plagiarists of those philosophers. It's true. If you start this, Bruno Bauer did quite a good job. You compare the text of the Gospels to the writings of these philosophers, sheer plagiarism. And gradually, of course, by now, the church becomes absorbed as part of the state. For example, the Bishop of Jerusalem was originally regarded as the head of the church. The Bishop of Rome was nobody, really. He was subordinate. And now he's put in charge of the church. He becomes the Pope. That's where the Pope comes from. Nominated by the emperor as the emperor's stooge. If you like, he's the minister, the emperor's minister of religious affairs from now on. And the gains of the empire, of course, were colossal. The early Christians, for example, refused to recognize the state or served in the army. Now, all this was reversed. It was ditched. And the church becomes one of the main pillars of state and ferociously persecutes anyone who called its doctrine into question. Now, when Christianity becomes the state religion under Theodosius in 381, Heresy becomes a punishable criminal offence. And a ferocious campaign begins against everyone who refused to accept the official church doctrine. Many people resisted the changes and were put to death, cruelly. Like Arius of Alexandria, who had a lot of support. He rejected the Nicene Creed, as it was called, and his supporters, the Arians, were put to the sword. Over 3,000 Christians were instantly killed by their fellow Christians, and that was just the beginning. Arians, Donatists, Circumcellions, there were many, many, many other sects, with a mass following, by the way, who were persecuted and massacred without mercy, men, women, and children, no mercy. In reality, which is not generally known, many, many more Christians were killed by other Christians than were ever killed in 3 centuries of Roman persecution. That's a fact which is never mentioned, and it is a fact. It's also interesting that at least some of these sects or movements were said to have communistic tendencies. That's to say, they tried to defend the original teachings of Christianity. Now, by these means, these violent, corrupt means, did the church of the poor become transformed into one of the principal vehicles for the enslavement of the poor? And why did the early Christians not succeed? Well, you see, Marxism explains that communism, real communism, must have a material base. It depends on the attainment of a certain level of development of the productive forces of industry, agriculture, science, and technique. And the material conditions of that time meant that the conditions for communism were not sufficiently advanced to permit such a development. Therefore, the communism of the early Christians remained on a primitive level, the level of what you might call communism of consumption. That they paid in money, and poor people were clothed and fed and so on and so forth. Not real communism, which is based on the collective ownership, not consumption, but on the collective ownership of the means of production. And therefore, of course, despite the tremendous heroism of the early Christians, they were unable to realize their ideals, and ultimately they were condemned to fail. Now, today, of course, the church is one of the main instruments of the rich. The Vatican, for example, is one of the richest places on earth. I don't know how much money they've got. Nobody knows, because it's a secret, but it's vast. The fact that it also has big investments in banking, insurance, chemicals, steel, construction, real estate, and so on. In other words, it's part of the capitalist system, neither more nor less. You could argue that in reality there are still 2 churches, by the way. I mean, Latin America is particularly clear. There's still a church of the poor people who aspire to real Christianity, if you like. But there's also the church of the rich, and it's the church of the rich that dominates everywhere. Now, in Matthew says, no one can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be loyal to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and Mammon. Mammon is the god of money. That's in James. But today, of course, religion is big business everywhere, not just the Catholic Church, but the evangelist sects as well. They're all involved in money-making machine, and they're entirely of a reactionary character. Now, I just finished by saying that, you see, modern capitalism has now created the material base for genuine communism, for a genuine classless society. Look, in the Bible, because the blind could see, the deaf could hear, and so on. Well, now it is possible, quite possible, for the blind to see, the deaf to hear, the lame to walk. Even the dead sometimes can be raised by medical science. We don't require religion and miracles anymore. We have got science instead. And when we can perform sciences in real life, we do not require imaginary miracles. And when we're able to live a full and free and rich life as genuine human beings before we pass away, because you only live once after all, we got no need to console ourselves with an imaginary spirit world when you are dead, you know. In other words, and I'll finish on this note, when we have created a paradise in this world based on a nationalized, planned, harmonious economy, we will not require any dream about a paradise in the next one. And that is precisely what we're all fighting for and striving for. And unlike the early Christians, whose courageous example we can follow in many respects, we will not fail. We will conquer.